Was Socrates an asshole? I've been going through some videos and lectures about him on the internet, primarily some interpretations by young YouTubers, and for some reason I feel like these people's perception of him is pretty negative. He's being described as an annoying piece of shit who just went around Athens arguing with people about everything, and as someone who undermined democracy and was ultimately in favor of tyranny, and also for some people, more or less a pedophile, because he slept around with young boys. And these are, of course, partially the same reasons that people of his own time had him tried and executed for. So are these perceptions of him, apparently both ancient and modern, are they actually true? I mean, kind of, but also not really. The problem with these claims is that they are just too broad. Like with anything, you can't just pass such general judgment on anything without observing and deconstructing the specific details, just like Socrates himself would have stated, I'm sure. So let's have a quick look at these statements about him and see how true they are, at least in my understanding. Let's start with the easiest one. Was Socrates an asshole who went around town questioning people about everything and being annoying for no reason? Well, I would definitely not describe talking to people on the street as something bad. Of course, my personal feeling as a pretty antisocial and agoraphobic person is that if someone I don't know just stops me on the street and starts asking me questions about something, it's not that I would react abruptly or in a negative way, but I'd probably be wondering just quietly in my mind whether this person is insane or whether they want to stab me and rob me. The problem is, though, me being in the street in a modern city is vastly different than a guy in the streets of Athens 2,500 years ago. People live in the millions in modern cities. And ancient Athens was basically the size of a big village by our standards. It was a social environment where most people knew each other, so a random person stopping you on the street in our time is much more weird and unusual than a person stopping you on the street in an ancient small scale society. Not all people in Athens knew Socrates personally, but they probably knew about him and knew who he was, so I really doubt they found it that weird that he was just meeting them and cross examining them about life randomly. However, would they have found it annoying or even offensive that he would just question their views on politics, religion, morality, and whatever? Again, my modern brain would be very suspicious of a person in the street who just starts talking to me about such stuff. But do I think it's necessarily bad? And do I think that makes Socrates an asshole? No, I don't. I even think the opposite. Such a person feels to me like so much above all of us, psychologically speaking. You cannot imagine how much I hate everyday life chores and everyday problems and people who are all about these things without an ounce of thought about some higher ideas. I get so depressed while walking on the street and, going around town on the public transport, and I hear people talking about whatever the hell they want to eat, or what kind of alcohol they drink, or what clothes they bought, or who they had sex with, or what's the price of gas or housing or whatever. I hate this. I mean, those are things you gotta take care of naturally, but them being in your mind constantly is just lethal to me. I I love it when I go around somewhere and I hear people talking about science or have a religious debate or talk about the universe or whatever. If Socrates was someone who went around asking people about the more important stuff in the world and making them break out of their stupid everyday lives, I say more power to him. I have to say, if I were not as shy as I am, I would have done the same. The difference between me and Socrates is that he actually liked people and liked talking to them. I don't. I mean, I like humanity as a phenomenon, and I'll always be fascinated by human history and thought and the drama of our existence. But when it comes to real nowadays people and knowing them personally, it is extremely rare that I'd come across a person I'd actually want to spend time with. Besides my family, I have like 4 or 5 close friends, and even those I see about once a month, if not less. So, no, I definitely do not think Socrates was an ass because he cross examined people. Even better, expose the idiots for being idiots. Too many people just walk around with their opinions being insane, with no one ever questioning them, and them solidifying those same stupid opinions in their brains just because no one ever opposed them, and also because it's quote unquote their opinion. There is this pervasive view nowadays that a personal opinion is something sacred to everyone, and everyone has the right to it and to express it just because it's their opinion. I hate this. We all live in the same reality, and there's no such thing as an individual reality for everyone. Solipsism isn't fucking real. Just because you have an opinion, and it's your opinion, it doesn't mean you can't be wrong and your opinion should be safe from scrutiny. For example, I've argued with so many people on religion and stuff, and whenever I back them into a corner with no logical escape for them, they just say, well, it's my opinion. Like, this is some kind of a reasonable finale for them. Who cares if it's your opinion? It's idiotic and it's not a valid argument. I'm asking you to try and rationalize your thoughts on things with actual logic and arguments. When you see your arguments broken, that's okay. We can talk about it and figure it out. We can maybe change and reshape your opinion so that it's improved. And the same, of course, applies to me. I'm always ready to change my stance whenever someone shows me a hole in my thought process. And this has happened to me numerous times. I would be 3 times as stupid nowadays if it weren't for all the people who corrected me on my bullshit. There is nothing wrong with that. It's how people communicate, exchange ideas, learn, and improve. If I'm willing to engage in that, and you just stand there and tell me it's enough that you have an opinion, because that makes your opinion valid, well, fuck you. Socrates was not an asshole in this regard. He just didn't care about bullshit, and he liked to think about the important stuff in life. And we can attest to that from the physical descriptions we have of him. He blatantly hated materialism. He was ugly as hell, and he didn't care about it. He walked around dirty and unkempt. He didn't even bother with wearing shoes. He was utterly and totally untouched by physical vanity. And I mean, it's not that I like it when I see some asshole in the street smelling like shit. I hate it, and I probably would have hated this in Socrates as well. Because you can lack physical vanity while also taking a shower every day, you know what I mean? So I would have criticized him for that at least. But even so, I find this so refreshing about him, and also in people nowadays. I love it when I see, for example, a guy who doesn't seem unrelaxed and embarrassed because he's not good looking, or a girl who walks around without any makeup. On the contrary, even, I sometimes have happened to have a crush on the most unexpected person, not so good looking, not conventionally attractive, but just a person who seems kind of above these things, and a person who can substantively talk to me about something other than work or sex or memes. And I guess this was the case with Socrates as well, because he's supposedly famous for having slept around with many guys, some of whom were the hottest guys in Athens at the time. And how could a person have achieved this with his level of hygiene? Imagine, I don't know, Danny DeVito managing to convince Brad Pitt to sleep with him. Yes, it was pretty much the equivalent of that. And it actually happened. So there must have been something about him that could attract people, both socially and sexually. And I think it's pretty clear that this something was his value as an intellectual. Now, on the second problem, was Socrates someone who hated democracy? You could kind of say that. He was an opponent of it, but can we necessarily disagree with him? Practically speaking, yes, democracy would be the best option, taking of course into account that there's a severe difference between the democracy Socrates lived in and the democracies that we live in. Yes, democracy is always preferable to monarchies and dictatorships, although, might I say, there's a fringe percentage of stupid people who claim they prefer a dictatorship similar to Russia or North Korea. There's all sorts of people in the world, but even so, the overall consensus is that democracy is better. However, would it be possible that not always the democratic system is the best option? I would say that it's not impossible, though I can't give a better option to replace democracy. What option did Socrates prefer? Well, he wanted an oligarchy, basically a ruling class of powerful rich people to govern the masses, because in Socrates' mind, given how prone he was to just randomly cross-examine people in the streets, in his view, the general public was very stupid. Now, was he an asshole for having that opinion? I would say yes. It's very obnoxious to consider people generally stupid, but here comes the other problem. I happen to agree with him. From what I've seen so far from my 30 years of walking this earth, yes, most people are generally pretty fucking stupid, which also isn't inherently bad. You can be stupid and still be a good person. I don't mind if you don't care about books. I don't mind if you don't want to talk about philosophy or science or history. I don't mind if if you only care about everyday life, as long as you're a genuinely good person. I've called people stupid before, and they usually always take it as an insult, which on my part, it really isn't, at least not always. When I said it on those occasions, I used the word as meaning just uninterested and bland when it comes to life. You know how there's this kind of people who just go through life not being interested in anything and being fucking fine with it? I'm fine with that as well. If you're that kind of person, and I happen to love you, and I call you stupid, I only meant uninterested in higher ideas. So I'm sorry, it's just an error of expression. I still love you, you fucking idiot. But returning to Socrates and the democracy by the stupid general public. Yes, I agree with him. I'm just not okay with every illiterate moron expressing their opinion as if it's sacred or valid, and I'm also not okay if these people can vote, which they could in Socrates' time. They can, of course, vote nowadays as well, but with our modern elections, it's very questionable as to how effective the voting systems are, especially in countries like mine. And so Socrates hated democracy and wanted to replace it with an oligarchy. Does that mean he wanted Athens to be like North Korea or something? Of course he didn't. Socrates, and by extension Plato, was elitist in a sense that he did prefer to be ruled by a class of nobility, but he didn't just mean he wants brutal dictators. What he wanted was a ruling class of philosophers like himself, who would be able to exercise absolute power, but also be aware of what is good and just in life. If you have a so-called benevolent tyrant, who is an intellectual and has a sense of justice and whatever, then this means that under this tyrant, yeah, maybe you won't be able to vote, but then you won't be thinking of changing the regime in the first place, because your life would be good. If everyone is taken care of, if there is no injustice in society, if you have a government that's deeply philosophical in the way that Socrates and Plato were, would that be so bad? I don't think so. Of course, there's the problem of this being impossible as a concept, because as we all know, the ideas of Socrates and slash Plato, even though nice, are just too idealistic, and you can't just apply them to an entire country simply because people are people. You'll never be able to assemble an entire government of benevolent philosophers and scientists. And by the way, you can also be a philosopher and a scientist without being benevolent. So yeah, the idea is just too ideal and impossible to accomplish in practice. And so, was Socrates an asshole for thinking democracy was stupid and wanting a government of philosophical tyrants? No, I don't think so. Like all other people, he was just not satisfied with the status quo, and he liked to dream. And then the final and most difficult point. Was he a P-word because he slept around with young boys? Well, this is a very sensitive problem that would probably need its own entire series of videos, but I would say in terms of our modern understanding of what a P-word is, no, he wasn't. The uncomfortable thing to grasp is that back then in antiquity, and especially in ancient Athens, it was actually the norm that older men would sleep around with young boys, and this was viewed, if you can believe it, as something of an, how should I say it, an internship for the boy? Because supposedly the boy was sleeping with an older guy that was, say, a powerful politician, or an experienced craftsman of some sort, or a poet, or a philosopher like Socrates was. And so the perception was that it was mutually beneficial as a relationship between the two, the older guy getting sexual pleasure, and the younger guy getting quote-unquote wisdom from the older guy in exchange, so you could basically call it some form of prostitution or something. I mean, yeah, in modern terms, that would be sick and indeed exploitation. But the problem with historical context is that you cannot dismiss it when analyzing historical figures. Socrates lived in a society where this was acceptable, and so he never got the idea that what he's doing might be disgusting. If he lived in our time, he probably would have had a different perception of it, and he would have acted differently. And if he didn't, off to jail with him. But again, he, unfortunately, not only has been dead for 2.5 millennia, but also lived in a world where this was okay. So does he deserve the modern label of a P-word? Absolutely not. And by the way, we have a perfect example to depict this kind of ancient versus modern world comparison and see how it's possible for one social tendency to become unacceptable over time. Oscar fucking Wilde, the Victorian writer, you know how he's kind of depicted like this sort of dramatic gay icon that was imprisoned unjustly? Well, he kind of had it coming. He, much like, ancient Greek philosophers, went around and slept with young boys, literally sexual exploitation. He even used this same argument of the ancient philosophers in court while being tried, said that his love of those young boys was the same love that the ancients exercised in Greece. In this case, this argument did not work, and in my opinion, rightly so. Yes, I wouldn't say Socrates was the P-word, but Socrates lived in his world 2,500 years ago. Both Socrates and his world have been gone for the same number of years. The values of that long-gone world do not apply to our modern world. So in conclusion, before I break my jaw, no, I don't think Socrates was an asshole, nor was he a tyrant lover, nor an abuser. He had his problems, of course. He was maybe arrogant, and for sure very idealistic. But that being said, I still consider him an amazing human being and one of the most important people to have ever existed. Him and Plato, of course, because you can't have one without the other.